Y'all, welcome back to Kentucky Fried Wargaming, where two guys who aren't qualified to talk about anything decide to talk about a game with hard math and chance. I'm Joe.
And I'm John.
And on this episode, we continue our journey to do faction focuses for maybe one day all of the Warhammer factions in Warhammer 40K. And this one is kind of difficult to do on its own. Because a lot of the flavor becomes very individualistic in this faction. But you gotta start somewhere, you gotta have a foundation. Today, we're gonna talk about Space Marines.
Space Marines!
Space Marines, they're on the boxes! They're very cool. And they are. They are cool. Like, off the rip, I think if I had to describe them, they're cool. They're the poster boy for a reason.
Yeah.
But there's some stuff in there that, like, I think is worth talking about if you're a new player, so you could really understand who these people are on the box. So I think if you don't understand the lore and the fluff, you could maybe get a simplistic understanding of who they are, why they are what they are, where they came from.
Yeah, like there's like the first level story, and then there's a deeper story with the Space Marines. Like, off the rip, when you look at them, everyone sees the same thing, which is like big dudes in big armor with like big weapons who pew pew and like die for the Emperor. But there is a deeper story there of like their existence, why they exist, how it's tragic, like their progression to become what they are, and like the nuance between the different chapters.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of chapters. There's so many.
There's a reason why there's hundreds of books about Space Marines. It's not just because people love the like pew pew gunfight fight, but like there's a lot of discussion that can be had about the narrative around it.
Yeah, and so for this episode, we're going to focus on Space Marines in general, the high level, the stuff that is shared across chapters. You know, what they are, where they're from. And maybe later, if you guys are interested, we can break down particular what's called factions, which are specific like chapters in the lore of Space Marines who have their own culture and twists on these. But we got to start at the high level. And I think we're going to do that through the idea of like, where does the Space Marine come from? And we work through their journey. And that should, over time, kind of explain to us how they work. First things first, Space Marines. They are not born a Space Marine.
No.
Space Marines have to be recruited. And specifically recruited as children.
Yes.
And this is where the tragedy starts. But because of the way that Space Marines are made and mutated, the sort of prime age to lower the chances of a Space Marine dying while being created is, around the age of puberty. So like 10 to 15 years old. Space Marine chapters on their planets, or, if they're on a fleet in their fleets, they have various cultural traditions which allow them to keep an eye out for promising young men who are, boys or just on the cusp of becoming a man, who are, particularly skilled at combat, or they're particularly intelligent, or they're particularly brutal or cunning or clever. And different chapters do this in like their own nuanced ways. But through one way or another, when they find children like this, they take them.
Yeah, it's very similar to like a bastardization of like older human rituals of like progressing into manhood, like doing a journey of some sort, or like a ritualistic like survival thing, something like that. But it's taken to such a ridiculous degree because it's Warhammer.
Yeah.
But also because it's to signify just how like terrible this stuff is, right? Like you might have 200 children be given knives and sent out into like these icy wilderness on Fenris, and like one will come back, and that one will then be one of the many aspirants they pick to go through the Space Marine thing. And then of the one, maybe 200 of those ones then show up, and then maybe 20 of those continue on. Like the amount of death that is and like suffering that is created just to make a single Space Marine is astronomical and crazy, and that is across almost every chapter.
Yeah,
like there's very few chapters that try to minimize the suffering of their aspirants.
if anything, the suffering is almost the point, because they're trying to, for lack of a better term, program this young man to be ready to be a machine of war, to brutally kill and have no fear. And to do that, traumatic experiences and brutality and testing both of those combined with brainwashing and like literal psychic suggestion in almost all cases can be a very effective cocktail to make a person detached and violent. And, they get all these aspirants together. They find them through, various watchways and traditions. They take them from their families. Sometimes they are willingly given up. Sometimes it's by force. They put them through some tests to see if they're worthy truly, and sometimes just killing other aspirants. And then, once you pass those, great. Now is time for surgeries. And we aren't going to go into all of them, but they take these young men who have survived these harrowing trials, and then they cut them open over months and shove their body full of extra organs, of, steroids and stimulants and all sorts of new chemicals which induce changes in their brain and their chemistry. And it makes them big, it makes them strong, it makes them hard to kill. But there is a high failure rate with doing this to a body. And again, if you get them young enough, the failure rate is lower, but it's still shockingly high. And I don't know if I've ever seen a hard number, because the Imperium doesn't track those numbers. They don't like to track numbers. You have to care about the number of lives lost, and they just don't, because it's the setting. But you could safely say that maybe 1 in 10 make it. And it's probably dramatically worse. Probably closer to 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. These are brutal changes. And even if you don't physically die, you might mutate, or they might not take correctly, and then they execute you. There's a lot of paths to death.
And this is also like the time where they're putting the gene seed in. Like they're putting the gene seed from other Space Marines into these like aspirants, in which they will adopt personalities of their Primarch and other Space Marines, and will warp them and change them and who they are as people. We'll also like warp them and change them physically to better fit like the thing that the Primarchs are or the other chapters are. So like Raven Guard, for instance, you might have somebody who joins the Raven Guard who is like normal, like maybe olive skinned with like blonde hair, or like just picking random traits, and all of a sudden their hair gets darker and their skin gets paler. That's because of the genetic manipulation. It's a thing. And then their mentality will change as well, and like their personality. It won't all become one, but it will be tinted by the way that like the genetics have changed them. And for some, this is just a mind shattering instance. And very often, a lot of these like doctors doing it or apothecaries doing it care more about the gene seed than they do about the aspirant, and will just kill an aspirant to get the gene seed back.
If it doesn't take well.
It is abundantly tragic. Like, don't get me wrong, Space Marines are awesome. Like, they're super cool because they have like chainsaw swords and like bolter gun, but like the story behind their existence in the setting is very tragic.
Every one of them is a little story of horrific, harrowing survival. Every one of them. And that's, one of the things we like hitting home with this. And if you survive all of this, you don't have your mind shattered, your body doesn't give out, you don't mutate and then get executed. Like, you come out the other side of all this, and now you get to start fighting. Oh boy. And that's when they start giving you the gear. And you can look at the model ranges. Space Marines have a cornucopia of weapons and armor and tools and tricks that they can use in vehicles, all of which are like stemming from various technologies. The big ones you've seen are probably bolters, like the big, large rifles. They aren't actually, some of them are rifled, but they're not bullets the way you think of them. They're actually shooting mini rockets that explode on impact, which makes them uniquely horrifying and cool. Chain swords, really common. It explains itself. It's a sword that's a chainsaw, which is freaking awesome.
Dope.
I love that. Or like bolt pistols. Same thing, just in pistol form. They also have various types of armors that you can see them wear. And there are a lot of armor types. It's like cars. There's make and models and years. And they have variations in how they look, which tells you roughly how old the armor is. But if you're a new player and you're looking at this, the big thing I want to hit on here is that like the armors can mix in an army. They do not all have to be the same looking armor. For example, the modern armor is Mark 10, but if you have older models or older Marines, you can easily run them. There's no rules. It's totally fine. Just means their armor is older or more ornate or kind of like a relic from the past.
The only real difference there is you have normal power armor, and then you have Terminator armor, which is
big, bulky lead armor.
Big, bulky, like crazy armor. That is just built for the worst possible conditions. Believe there's actually like the Terminator armor STL was like originally made out of like for mining, like in the old glory days of humanity.
Now for crushing skulls.
Now for crushing skulls. Yeah.
And
like
Gravis armor is similar, just modern design.
Yep.
It's brutal.
They have tanks. They have everything that every other army does, but it's all very similar. And then there's slight variations for each chapter. But they are essentially the elite force of the like Imperium, so they can get outfitted with whatever they want, and they get whatever they want to be outfitted. Las cannons, multi-meltas, flamers, bolt guns, chain swords, like their armories are massive. And part of the reason they're massive is because of the politics behind the Space Marines. And that is that each of these chapters are their own individual force capable of like outfitting themselves, getting own resources, having the ability to do stuff. I mean, they send tech marines to Mars to learn how to do like Messiah tech marine stuff and learn how to like maintain vehicles and equipment, learn how to maintain all sorts of stuff. They send like people to the Death Watch, learn how to kill Xenos and work with other Space Marine chapters. They come back. But the big thing here is that even though they have all this freedom per se, they're still beholden to what the High Lords of Terra want to do and what the Imperium does as a whole. Because even if they are divergent in behavior, the Inquisition is always about to knock on the door.
Ooh, and sometimes that they have knocked hard in dramatic, horrific, cruel fashion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think here it's sort of like the armor. It's one of those things that we don't want to break down too much, but it kind of gets your narrative gears spinning. If you're a new player, you're making your first faction. And let's be honest, like if you're watching this type of video, you might be playing for the first time. And if you're playing for the first time ever, and you're making your first army, there's a large chance it's going to be Space Marines. It's the most popular faction, especially for new players. And that means you're probably starting to think about your story for your own little minis. And in that case, understanding the basics of how these politics work can help you get some traction on what kind of story you want to tell with your own minis or your own chapter. But largely, Space Marines aren't beholden to anyone in theory. They can't be necessarily directly commanded by anyone other than like the Adeptus Custodes to do anything. But there's a lot of soft pressure in the Imperium.
Yeah, and sometimes that soft pressure turns into much bigger problems. A thing to look into is the Badab War, to see what happens when Space Marine chapters don't follow the rules.
It becomes bad quickly.
Yeah, the entire Horus Heresy is about Space Marine legions who just go, you know what? What if I want to do things differently?
And sometimes this does come to blows. It does.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just like pithy, passive-aggressive arguing on comms and stuff, but it does come to war. And you can use that as a narrative tool if you're fighting like another Imperial faction on the tabletop and you want to like have a reason why you're fighting. These sort of inter-factional politics can give you a reason why you're going to war with one another. You know?
Yeah, even some of the first legions do it, like the Dark Angels and Space Wolves have an ongoing rivalry.
And have outright murdered each other. The burning of Fenris.
Absolutely.
There's a story if you want to read that. Where manipulation happens and the politics cause a war. So they're not immune. And I think, honestly, though, like, for me, this gets into just, like, the fact that this is horrifically tragic. Like, they've survived all of this. They've been mutated. They've not gone insane. They've gotten their armor. They survived some battles. They fight the worst of the worst that the galaxy could belch at them. They are the Emperor's angels. They have an untold amount of knowledge and prowess in war. They've lost countless battle brothers. Their emotion in some chapters has been like systematically ripped out of them, all in the name of a greater service to the Imperium. And they might just get capped by that same Imperium that they did all of that sacrifice for. All because of a petty High Lord not liking that someone told him no. It's so horrifically sad and comically wicked, which is part of why 40K is fun.
Yeah.
But I feel like there are a couple of times during the breakdown where we just have to, like, pump the brakes. Oh, buddy, that's bad. And this is one of those moments where, oh, buddy, it could be bad.
Yeah, like one of the things that always strikes me with Space Marine stories from like a tragic outlook is how many of these characters or people they have spent an innumerable amount of suffering and time and hundreds of years fighting, and they still go, boy howdy, I want to make like art, or like I want to talk to a person, like I want to be able to be a human being and not be just a machine of war. And then they are immediately hit with the reality of, no, that's not for you. You are just built to punch stuff to death. I think, like, I'm going to shout out Baldermont. I don't know the exact video. I can try to find it. But Baldermont does, like, short stories before he does his lore videos. And one of the short stories he does between, like, a blood angel and, like, a normal human that he sees every time he passes by to go to another planet at, like, a substation.
Mm-hmm.
And just the little moments. And I think it captures, like, what it is for the Space Marines that is so tragic so well. Is this Space Marine doesn't age. But, like, this person does. And you're seeing it from the perspective of the person who is friends with this Blood Angel. And, like, he's watching his friend not age, and he's getting older. And he also just keeps watching his friend get more sad, and he doesn't know why.
Why is the angel sad?
Exactly.
How do you make an angel sad?
Like, this, it is tragic, but it's so good. It's got like a good pathos to it in a story.
Yeah.
Which makes you feel bad for these essentially tools that a system is taking advantage of. A system that no one really knows how to control anymore and just kind of does whatever it wants. The Supreme Grand Leader of the Imperium is sitting on a golden throne, doesn't actually talk to anybody. He's just a corpse.
I think I'd rather have a random woman in a lake distributing swords as my method of governance. Like, this is asinine. Yeah, Horus Heresy has a lot of this. Even modern 40K has quite a bit of this, depending on your chapter. Blood Angels, Salamanders, God forbid you read Lamenter's lore. There are even some Space Wolves who, like, there are stories about Marines in these chapters who have held on to more of their humanity and want to use it. And want to be more, and then are browbeaten about it. And it, especially in Horus Heresy, is part of what led to the Horus Heresy. And they, I don't know, depending on your perspective, you could just view them as mindless killers or like really cool guys. And that's fine. But there's more nuance under here when you're writing your own characters or your own chapter that you could kind of play with a little bit. And I think you could have more fun with that. The thing though that like they are made for, that they are forced to do regardless of like if they want to do stuff outside of it though, is purely war. And they are good at it. In the setting, they're one of the most effective battle forces in the galaxy.
Yeah, like the game doesn't really do a good job of showing just how powerful Space Marines are. But like 200 Space Marines can show up on a planet that has like hundreds of thousands of soldiers against each other, and they will just completely decimate the side they choose to go against.
Yeah. And
like they can cut the head off of the snake and completely end a war in an afternoon.
And that's the key, is because Space Marines don't fight the way like Imperial Guard do. Like, depending on how you imagine things, you might picture war to be like a grinding advance. And for Imperial Guard troops or Sisters of Battles troops, that might be true. You know, you're in the trenches, you're shooting for days, you're shooting for months, you're trading shots over the top, you're raining a bunch of artillery. Space Marines don't do any of that. Space Marines are not high in number. They are needed all over the galaxy, everywhere. You know, these are elite warriors. We've already talked about how long it takes to make one person into a Space Marine. And that means there's not a lot of troops to go around. So when they get into a war zone, they want to end it immediately with ruthless efficiency. And they do a lot of that through direct assault, shock, and awe tactics, where they're going to look at an enemy force over, like, let's say like a holodeck. You're looking at a whole sort of country, and okay, there's like 8 war fronts. Okay, which one is the key one? Well, this one is holding the road to the capital, and if that falls, everything's going to crumble. But that's where their heaviest, resistance is. Great, we're going there, and then they will target wherever that command is, or the HQ, wherever the heaviest, guarded high value target is, and from the skies, with no warning, they will rain giant metal boxes that are dropped from atmosphere that will barely slow themselves down just before impact, slam into the ground hard enough to create giant tremors and impact craters, killing who knows how many people at impact from debris and shock, and staggering and blinding everyone else around them before the doors are blasted open with explosives and outpour a whole squad of Space Marines shooting mini rockets at everything near them. While on the top, a giant machine gun that's an automated turret starts clearing a little path. And that's for one squad. One squad. There are many squads that are going to drop with them. And then they're going to start storming up the field, covered in enough armor to be an M1 Abrams tank. They're going to murder everyone near them. They're going to ignore all the shots that are hitting them. All of this has happened in about 3 seconds. You haven't even recovered from the blast yet. And about that time, secondarily, jump pack troops are probably coming in while everyone is looking forward to jump into your backline with chainsaw swords that are tearing spines and spleens out and throwing them left and right, creating a fountain of gore. And that's assuming that there's no air support to start strafing your lines with colossal pseudo-nuclear rockets and bombs. And the tanks are going to start rolling in here in about 15 seconds.
Yeah, you're going to have like Thunderhawk dropships like dropping whole squads of bikes, and like dreadnoughts, just whole cloth dropping from Storm Ravens, just like obliterating things.
And it all happens so rapidly that...
Yeah.
Like, from a human scale, how do you dare respond to that? The answer is it's very hard to. And that's what makes them so effective. And they do that on the hardest place, knowing where they're getting into. And whenever they can, they're going to drop hard, hit hard immediately off the bat, shoot while they storm up the field, and then get in close and ruin whatever's left. And once that happens in your rear lines at your highest fortified position, everyone else probably not going to want to fight anymore. You're not going to fight anymore. You've been in this like trench warfare for 8 months to years. You've got a gun made out of spare parts. Like, you're not fighting anymore. You're probably going to give up. And that's their job, is to make these like huge, brutal assaults through combined arms, shock and awe, and then make the enemy never want to fight again. Because they are the Emperor's angels, and they land with his wrath. And boy, howdy do they.
And each chapter does things differently. Like, Blood Angels prefer jetpacks and like dropping from space. White Scars prefer rolling up on their Huffy bikes with like grenade launchers attached. It's great. Dark Angels prefer to show up with like plasma and like Terminators mixed with combined arms of like bike units to like really surgical strike, even more so than normal surgical strike. Space Wolves just like the Space Wolves do whatever. Space Wolves are the wildest of all of them.
But generally speaking, you're going to see a lot of combined arms. Just some chapters are going to lean one way or the other. And I think that's where we can sort of make some distinction. Is that there are some chapters that are more by the book than others.
Yes.
And I mean that literally. The Codex
literally
Astartes.
The Codex, Codex Astartes. Because like the Codex Astartes is a book that was written after the end of the Horus Heresy by Gilliman to try to prevent the Horus Heresy from ever happening again. By splitting up all of the legions, which were previously tens and thousands of Marines, into chapters of no more than 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
So that no one legion could threaten the entire galaxy. Didn't work out that well, but it did create like a handbook of how to be Space Marine that some choose to follow and some go, I don't like books. Reading's not for me.
I never learned to read.
Yeah. So like, Joe, tell me about one of those Codex compliant chapters.
Sure. What, you want me to talk about this one? Oh, okay. Oh, you're going to take the non-compliant. All right.
Or I can just talk about the Imperial Fists.
I do think the Imperial Fists are
Angels.
cool. I think the Imperial Fists are a great example. There's a lot of them, but
yeah, I think that Imperial Fists, right? Codex compliant chapter, because the first thing you read Codex compliant, you're like, oh, so they're boring. Like, maybe.
It means they're like pseudo predictable, I would say.
Yes. And I think that the Imperial Fists do a really good job of maybe challenging that. The Imperial Fists are a legion from the old times, from the Horus Heresy, one of the first founding legions, that their entire ethos is one of like defense and standing your ground and not giving any ground. So this means they normally are performing a lot of like defensive tactics in like theaters of war, where a lot of the other Space Marines are very like direct, confrontational. Instead, they pick the point that can't fall and say, no, this is where I die. This is my last stand. And that is the Imperial Fist ethos. And the Codex allows them to just do that more efficiently, because then everyone knows what the rules are, so everyone knows when we fall back. Everybody knows what gun every guy has. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows the exact fighting way we do. It's very similar to like an old phalanx, right? Where you have interlocked shields with bolters sticking out of them, shooting at whatever's coming. And then as soon as that thing arrives, the bolter shield guys move back, and the dudes with power swords and shields go forward and start stabbing it. Like,
all in lockstep, all predictably.
Yes, and that is the Codex Astartes way of fighting for them. It is very cool. It's very good. It in the setting is like you hear about it, and then when you see it written in a book, you go, "Wow, that's way cooler than I thought."
Yeah, it's super effective.
It's super, super cool when you see it. And like a lot of the Imperial Fists also are of that mindset where they are dour, dutiful soldiers who do what they have to do. They put their entire identity aside. And it kind of feeds into the tragedy of it. Like, they do not see themselves as anything besides the wall in which the perceived darkness breaks. Doesn't matter if it's a demon. Doesn't matter if it's a Tau. Doesn't matter if it's a Khorne Berserker. Doesn't matter if it's a civilian that they have to defend themselves from. They're just like, no, this is my job to stand here. I am a wall.
And it's cool. It's just cool. It's sad, but it's so cool. Like, I can see why they're on the box. Like, I just can't.
Mm-hmm.
For me, though, like, if I'm talking about Codex non-compliant chapters, though, chapters who look at the Codex and take a lot of it, but then heavily deviate in a particular aspect. There are a couple of these, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Blood Angels. I'm going to pick the Blood Angels every time. Every time I'm allowed to talk about the Blood Angels, I'm going to talk about the Blood Angels, and you can't stop me. And because the Blood Angels do take most of the Codex to heart. They use the same guns. They use the same battle tactics. They have the same ranks and stuff. That's all true. But there's a big problem in that the Blood Angels have a little mutation which makes them, let's not mince words. There's a short video.
It's a little bit, little mutation.
They're Draculars. Like, they're space vampires. I don't know what do you want from me? They're space vampires. That creates problems when your codex says that anything that is mutated must be purged. And you got to put them down. You would cease to be. And secondarily, they have another flaw called the Black Rage, where they're all trying not to fall to this permanent savagery, where they see themselves as, Sanguinius fighting against Horus to defend their father, the Emperor. And when that happens, they are no longer sane, and they cannot come back from the brink. Your battle brother is gone. And if the Codex was right, you would immediately kill your battle brother. And he's your only buddy. Like, these 8 guys in your squad around you are your only friends. Are you really going to want to put them down? For the Blood Angels, the answer is no. So the way they heavily deviate is allowing this mutation to work to enhance their tactics from the Codex by deviating from it strategically. So obviously, there's this tendency for anger and rage, and it makes them devilishly effective in close combat, so fine. Let's lean into it. So Blood Angels, they have the intercessors, they have, the tanks, they have the flyers, but they also have a lot of jetpack units with heavy weapons or power weapons who can, on fiery angelic wings, drop it from the sky, land into your back line, and get into the melee fight as early as possible to turn big, heavily armored warriors or generals into tin cans with fury and blood. And for the brothers who have fallen to the Black Rage, which is a whole other thing we don't have time to talk about, instead of just immediately putting them down, they have Marines who are their chaplains. These are sort of like preachers in other Space Marine chapters, who learn how to empathetically connect with these hallucinations and then gently steer them to get them back home. And if they can do this, they could take those battle brothers who would have to be put down according to the Codex, bind them in chains, you adorn them in battle honors and every bit of their life that they do not remember. And then on your next battle, you put all of those guys who are losing their minds and are permanently angry, and you put them in a dropship, led by the preacher, who can kind of steer them where they need to be effective, and then give them a hellacious final moment of glory as Rip and Tear plays, to just get stuck in on the biggest target they can find. And is that in the Codex? No,
I don't think that's in the book. That's not in the book. Book don't have that. No chapter.
I did Control F. It's not there, but it's effective. And everyone knows they're effective, which is why people don't push them on it. Because it works. And if you really wanted to make it a thing, I guess you could. Again, back to the politics thing. You could try to censor them. But do you then want to fight them? And so far in the lore, the answer's no.
No.
The answer's no. It's just not worth the fight. Same thing with the Space Wolves. Same thing with the Dark Angels. Especially the Dark Angels, because they got a Primarch now.
100%. Daddy Lion's back. He's mad at his own sons, but he's mad at everyone else too.
Yeah. And all of the Codex non-compliant chapters are like this. If you're playing one of them, it can help you write your own fluff. They deviate, but in a way that makes them more effective. And in a way that's not such a deviation that it's really like an imminent problem to the Imperium. It's just a breach from Imperial protocol, which in itself, some people in the setting, High Lords of Terra, find dangerous because it could question their own power base eventually, but isn't such a problem that it's worth the smoke to try to go fist fight any of these non-compliant chapters. It's just not. And hopefully through these examples, you get an idea of Codex compliant and not in all of this. But y'all, we've got to end on the fact that we have left out so incredibly much.
There's so much.
So many of these chapters are so incredibly unique with their own culture and history and motivations and backstories and where they're even going or their overall goals deviate highly in interesting ways. And there's hundreds of them. Not all of them are equally cool, but there's so many that are cool that we just can't talk about them in one video. So y'all, call to action time. This is the foundational video. Are there Space Marine chapters you want to hear us explore in depth? Like, you know, if you want a full video on Imperial Fists or a full video on Blood Angels, we can do that. Why not? I think it'd actually be fun. You know, there are people out there who's maybe getting into Space Marines, but you're sort of not sure what chapter you want yet. Maybe you're torn between 2 or 3 and you just want like videos on those. Put it in the comments. We are looking at what lore videos we want to do next, and this would be really helpful for us to know what people are wanting. Help us help you, so to speak. Because, dear Lord, John could talk about Space Marines for a while.
I could talk about Space Marine. I could talk about just in general all of this forever. That's fine.
Well, good thing it's
just give me a direction and I'll go.
I mean, someone might make you talk about Ultramarines, and then it's going to be a little sad. But it's fine.
Nah, Ultramarines have some cool like sub chapters, like Mortifactors.
Emperor Spears.
Also an option.
It's for another day. For now, that's been all of our opinions, bona fide and Kentucky Fried. We'll see y'all in the next video.